pertain to either war graves, final resting places, or sites of death. So considering the sort of omnipresence of death in our current life, I absolutely understand and take no offense if anybody feels that they need to prioritize their own mental health and emotional well-being at any point and leave the presentation. If you have any queries and you want to contact me later, but perhaps have us tone down on the discussion of the fact that they are final resting places, I'm happy to do so, but I don't think that I can dissociate that for this presentation. So now that we can actually talk about shipwreck heritage in Malta, let's begin. So navigating time and space. We're going to talk about, obviously, the past, present, and future. In the past, I am sorry, Neil, I do have to throw in just a dash of the geography and a very brief history of Malta just to contextualize what sort of sites we're later going to be looking at. In the present, we're going to be looking at what groundbreaking current activities are going on, meaning also, the past few years. The institutional protections that are starting to come into being, and the ever-present issues of accessibility in archaeology, and especially maritime archaeology. And then looking to the future, how do we ensure that there is a future of shipwreck heritage in Malta? And what can we do to sort of improve that accessibility moving forward? All right, so starting off with the geography and geomorphology, I promise this is probably the driest this presentation is going to be, and yes, that it is a deliberate pun. So if we look at this map, published in a paper by my professor at the University of Malta, he's been busy during the pandemic, we can see that I have issues with this map, but it's the best one I can find for the purposes that I want to point out. So we can see the fact that there is a bar here. It shows us what is less than 20 meters depth, and then 20 meters to 120 meters. And you can see that this spit of land, land, it's underwater now, connecting the Maltese archipelago and Sicily is in that 20 to 120 meter area. So it was at one point, and at one point, I mean 5 million years ago, all connected as one big landmass. And this is a massive range that they give us here, but it is significant. And I can attest to you having been out on the bathymetric boats, most of this is on the 120 meter side of it, not the 20 meter. But the reason why this is significant is in this sort of blown up picture of that one section of the map, this is the area that is only 20 meters deep surrounding Malta. And that is a very minuscule sort of area of coastline compared to if you look at other parts of the Mediterranean, like here in Libya and Tunisia, how wide beyond the coastline that 20 meters depth extends. So what this means is that the wave action that we actually get in Malta is going to be much more dramatic, like this cover picture. This is a calm day, and that's, right by one of the major cities. That's a calm day. So what it means is that when there's, but by no means, it's not what we see in the North Atlantic, where there's a much bigger fetch, a much bigger area that the waves are collecting speed and energy from. But when you so quickly have to take all that energy from the water column and compress it, it creates very strong, very forceful waves, which makes this area very dangerous to navigate. And that being said, the entire island is just bedrock, essentially. It's this sandstone. The entire island, literally, there's less than 5 centimeters on the main island of Malta of topsoil on average, which is absolutely boggling for someone who came from Canada, and you just, you can dig and dig and dig before you reach that bedrock. What that means essentially is that the population of the island has to be pretty small to be within its carrying capacity. So throughout most of its history, it has been reliant on maritime trade to sustain any sort of growth in population. The sandstone, this rock, the Globerina limestone, fantastic for building these ancient temples with very large, sometimes 2-3 meter long slabs of stone. Fantastic for creating salt pans and collecting salt, which was a very important resource, and great for graffitiing, very terrible for creating produce. And so you're probably thinking, a reliance on maritime trade and a lot of inaccessibility in that foreshore area does not seem to line up very well. And that is where Malta's saving grace comes in. It's the fact that it has all these natural harbors. And in fact, Malta's very first name, or actually rather the first names for Malta's main cities on both of the major islands, meant safe haven by the Phoenicians. And this is why Malta has almost continuously, since just after the megalithic tomb builders and temple builders, it's been almost continuously inhabited and occupied. So the alternative meaning of occupation, not just people living there, but a political, religious, and cultural imposition on the local inhabitants. So this goes from the Phoenicians in 800 BC to the Carthaginians, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Arabs, the Normans/Sicilians, and this is where we get a lot more of the religious implications coming in, to the Hospitallar Knights with the first siege, also known as the Great Siege, the French for 2 years with siege number 2, and the British for over 100 years with siege number 3 happening in World War II. Honorable mentions, of course, go to the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Vandals, and the Ostrogoths, who all occupied it for shorter periods of time and left slightly less material evidence of their occupation. And so this is what this presentation could have been if I didn't share all that. It could have been just a picture of the island, a map, all the different wreck sites sort of popped there, and me telling you, this is this wreck site, this is how deep it is, this is where it is, this is what you see. And honestly, that's not the way my brain thinks, and I can't do that. I think you absolutely miss out on the whole point of this archaeology if you don't have that context. But this is a good illustrative point. Out of the 50 advertised legal dive sites in the recreational zone, 21 of them are wrecks. I would say about 20 of them are wrecks of historical significance. That being said, the one that's not really historical significance was a ferry that actually floundered, but then was placed as a dive site. And then one of the other historical wrecks did not strike, like it was not, there was no loss of life with it, but it was towed to a place and then deliberately put there as a deterrent for other boats going into the area during a war, and then also as a dive site. And so that would be the HMS Maori near Valletta. And so with this illustration, you can also sort of see all the natural bays that I was referring to. And this, of course, here, this little squiggly body of water is the Grand Harbor. And it's very misleading looking because it looks like about 7 different inlets. But that entire area was the Grand Harbor, and that came into being during the Knights of St. John's occupation, which was in the 1500s onwards. And they built that massive fortified city that you see here. Like this was about a meter deep wall that I was putting my phone on to take this picture. And this is the Lazaretto, or the Quaranta, the quarantine island that you see right, well, actually you can't see it here, you'll see it in the next bit. But I wanted to include this photo here because I think this is sort of a photo of time travel itself, because from this historic city, I'm looking out over the quarantine, which strikes a whole different chord in today's day and age. But this was how the Hospitallar Knights got their name, really. They took care of people and they prevented illness by setting up this initial quarantine. And people had, like, you know, we look back a year ago and everybody was complaining about having to spend 2 weeks in a mandated quarantine. They had 40 days and they weren't allowed to leave their boats. And that is where quarantine gets its name from, the Quaranta, and also Lazaretto, which is what it was called because of Lazarus, who sort of rose from the dead. It was your chance to see if the people were going to die or not on these boats, if they were carrying pathogens. And unfortunately, that structure is no longer there as it is today. For the past 20 years, there's been repeated proposals to create a development on the site, and when it was finally accepted as I was leaving. And so even though it became very popular use during the 1500s, the island is littered with sites from the Romans and earlier. So I've highlighted here the 21 wrecks, but there's certain wrecks in particular that, to me, need a little bit more attention, probably because not everybody can dive them. So these wrecks, they're all absolutely lovely. But if these are dive shop sort of certified, cultural heritage has checked off on them, you're allowed to go visit them wreck sites, there's a lot of photographs of them online. Everybody's happy to take down their GoPros and upload all their images. And that's absolutely fantastic in terms of accessibility. We're here on the other side of the world, from all over the world, and we're able to sort of glimpse into this. But this is where we go back to that very first map that I was showing you. All of these wreck sites are in or very close to the 20-meter limit. And I'm annoyed by this 20-meter limit that Timothy Gambin has put on this map, but I know exactly why he did it. And that is because in the 80s, an archaeologist named Parker sort of came up with this graph, a bar graph showing what age all the different ancient wrecks in the Mediterranean were from, and came to the conclusion that the most seafaring happened in the Roman period, because that's when all the wrecks were found. And that could be a whole other conversation on how manipulated his statistics were and how inaccurate and sort of overblown his sample sizes were, and just so many issues. But what we know in Malta is that there's almost continuous evidence of wrecks from the Phoenician period onwards. And that is what I want to show in this presentation. So I'm going to leave the presentation now and take you guys to, oops. So this is another program that you guys can use if you're interested in the dive sites around Malta. You can actually see all the different dive sites a little bit more fully. And this actually is sort of interactive. It shows you whether it's a wall, a deep wreck, a deep reef, a shallow reef, a cave or an arch, or a wreck itself. And so you're going to notice they're all very close to shore. They're all within that 20-meter period and 20-meter depth range. And what's not shown here are the wrecks that you need special permission to go to, or the wrecks that exceed the recreational dive limit, or actually even that 20-meter limit that Parker originally created his graph based off of. So, and that's sort of what I was getting to with that, is Parker was making this assumption that seafaring only really happened during the Roman period based on the fact that he was able to see evidence of seafaring in forms of wrecks during the Roman period. An alternative conclusion could be that the Roman period was less efficient seafarers because there were more wrecks found from that period. But the other thing is that these wrecks that he was looking at, these assemblages, were only being reported from within that 20-meter depth, which was where sponge divers or the naked eye from above the surface of the boat was able to see. This was happening just around the time when scuba diving was becoming popular. So we didn't really have recreational divers going out exploring new areas and saying, hey, look, there's a wreck here, which is what happened with all these. You sort of see these wrecks, you report it to the Cultural Heritage Department, and we develop sort of an archive like this, and we start to know where wrecks are and learn about them. So you need very specific circumstances to find anything that's out in the rest of this area. And it's not that wrecks don't exist there, it's just that they haven't been found yet, or they're a little bit harder to get to. And one example of this is the Phoenician shipwreck that is off the coast of Schlendi, which is down here. So you can't even see it. It's not on this map, and it's not going to be on this map because it's a delicate archaeological site. And it's also 105 meters deep. So that's over a football field. For any Americans in the audience, it's over an American football field deep. So it's quite something to actually dive to it. And we're gonna watch a little video of it from when it was originally discovered. So it was discovered back in 2007. Let me see if I can put the volume on. So this was sort of a recreation of how they imagine it might have sunk. It sank just as it was leaving the harbor. And it was located during an incentive, the government wanted to map the whole seafloor because there was a number of Malta not having much space or much resources. They have to rely on natural gas and electricity and everything else coming from foreign nations. And so there's been proposals to do deep sea cables. And so in order to actually get clearing to do that, you need to make sure that your cables and your tunnels and everything else are not going to run through valuable resources, be they historic or biological. And so this is a team of very well-trained technical deep divers diving down to that 100+ meter depth, and with the added bonus, safety bonus of a submersible, sort of taking their first glances and excavating a little bit. And you can see what hazards can sort of be involved with excavating at that depth. Very easy to get blacked out, in terms of silted out, rather, I should say. Blacked out is a medical condition, which can also happen at that depth. And we will look at the 3D model that they've made of it. But I will say, you know, at that depth, and this is where land archaeologists will sort of laugh, because I'll tell somebody that, you know, we have to do all of our work in just, in this case, it was 12 minutes. 12 minutes you get to excavate on a wreck that site, 12 minutes to conduct your entire survey. And terrestrial archaeologists are sort of like, geez, we go out and we're digging, we're doing manual labor for like 8 hours in the day. You guys work for 12 minutes, that's it? And they forget the fact that on a 12-minute dive at that depth, you've got 6.5 hours of decompression time coming up. And probably the most nerve-wracking and stressful 6 hours of my life was being up on one of those boats, the research vessel, 10 minutes into our first dive going down and seeing bubbles and knowing I'm not supposed to see bubbles for another, 15 minutes or something. And it's just the jovial nature. You're having a cup of tea with your crewmates, and all of a sudden, everything goes silent. All you hear is the slapping of water against the hull of the boat and the occasional bird cry. And you realize something has gone wrong because there's bubbles. Because they were working on rebreathers with bailout tanks of specific blends of oxygen, nitrogen, helium that they want at different depths for their decompression. And yeah, so you're absolutely stuck. There's nothing you can do. You can send down another team a few minutes early, but you don't know what catastrophe has fallen. So you now have, you know that you are working on a site where 80 people died in the past, and you are just praying that you don't have another fatality associated with it, because so many things could have gone wrong. Rebreather could have failed. Somebody could have sprung a leak on their dry suit. Like, neither of those has good outcomes. And there's nothing you can do. Like, I'm sitting there on board knowing that I can't go down past 40 meters. So it's still going to be 3 hours before I know whether or not I can help in any way, shape, or form. But that being said, that shipwreck was the very first excavation at depth, archaeological excavation at least, that was conducted in the world. And the results of it have been quite spectacular. So there's this actual website that's been dedicated to it, a couple actually. But one of the magnificent things that they've done, that you guys can all do this, I'll put the links in the chat once I'm done giving my spiel, but you can actually come and select based on what year, what level of excavation you want to look at. And it's quite spectacular. This is a 3D photogrammetry model, and that was taken with a team of different photographers, and you can actually sort of, if it will load, sometimes it's a little bit slow, and especially I think sharing the screen does not help. But I'll talk about what the assemblage actually is in the meantime. The graphics on it are quite spectacular when it actually does load. You can get really fantastic details to the point that you can see the barnacles on the amphora. And what's interesting is that with this being an excavated site, this would not have been the way that this, I mean, it's blurry right now, but this would not have been the way that it was when it was first found. There would have been more sediment on top. So you can actually see, based on where the amphora are, at this depth of more than 100 meters, there's not currents and waves, actions and storms that are picking them up and shifting them the way that you will get with wrecks in shallower water. So you actually can see where the sediment has changed based on where the line of barnacles and invertebrate life, not the boring invertebrates, the good kind of invertebrates, have sort of landed on the amphora shells, which is to me just like absolutely spectacular, because that's a glimpse into site formation, that's a glimpse into paleoecology, and it's very interesting stuff. I know we're here for shipwrecks, I'm reining it in. And you're probably wondering, okay, well, where's the ship? Like, what are we looking at? And I know it's blurry, I'm sorry. I'm going to try refreshing it. This is my one claim to fame, probably. The very first piece of wood that was found on an actual archaeological excavation conducted systemically at depth was found by me. And it was a tiny little piece of wood. We were looking for murex shells, and murex shells are what the Phoenicians used to get that classic indigo purple color that the Romans later used for their senatorial togas, and that the British monarchy sort of clung to because it was so popular during the Phoenician age. The Phoenicians were so good at marketing it and taking it around the world that the shell actually went nearly extinct, this invertebrate. And so we were looking for these murex shells, and we were trying to determine, were the Phoenicians transporting it by, like in its raw form to be processed at site, or were they transporting it already developed into a dye? And so me being the one person on site with some marine biology background, they were like, hey, you're looking for the shell. So I'm taking very careful eyes. I'm looking at every piece of little broken invert shell that I find. I'm like, is this one? No, is this one? And I come across a tiny little piece of wood, which honestly is just absolutely bamboozling, because we have no clue where it came from, because there is no wood on this site that we've seen yet. Now, it is possible this is the first layer of amphora that was in the actual hull of this vessel. It is possible that if they lifted out all the amphora, you would actually find some of the hull intact. Theory being that this very heavy cargo actually nestled and helped the ship's hull itself actually nestle into the sediment as it was sinking, versus, and this is where that Parker's graph from the 1980s is so wrong. It's not that there was more sailing during the Roman period, it is that the Romans used the most cargo that was very heavy and inorganic. Because if you have an organic cargo or something that's not clay and stone based like the Phoenicians were carrying here and like the Romans carried with their amphora, it's going to float away when your boat is sinking. And so your boat is not going to get nestled into the sediment, which is going to protect it from the boring invertebrates that will eat all the wood. And so there is hope that perhaps there is wood underneath, but definitely we know the top deck and the superstructure of this vessel is lost to the ages. But what we do get to see is what their actual, if I can get this to work. So these here, yes, success. These, and you can see the little starfish, sea star, oh, sorry. So this here are grinding tablets. These were large, almost a meter long limestone tablets that would have been used to actually grind flour, to grind flax, and to create sort of products that could be eaten. And then these were amphora. And so there was testing done on some of the amphora that were collected. And the wreck, if I can zoom out enough, you can actually see it is quite shaped like a ship. It does sort of have this point at either end. And so it's amphora in the middle, amphora, with grinding tablets at either end, which are now cut off for some reason. And so that would have just been a distribution of weight. And there were some interesting individual pieces, but the amphora and the limestone tablets carried the majority of the bulk of what this vessel was carrying. And they sort of tell the tale of what, you know, day-to-day products for the Phoenicians were. Subsistence, wine, garum, potentially this dye. All right, and so there's more information on the shipwreck project here. This is another link that I will pass along. There's museums now dedicated to it. Oh no, participate, cooperate, please. Let's see. Okay, waiting for that to go away. See if I can get this screen to work. All right, but so you're gonna notice, all right, so a Phoenician shipwreck, what about everything else? I mentioned 3 great sieges. In shallower waters, the wrecks that you're going to get are going to be metal wrecks, because there's going to be more sort of the biological chemical activities that will disintegrate wooden wrecks. And so there are, of course, a number, like wrecks didn't just stop in the ancient period. We have modern wrecks, absolutely. And unfortunately, a lot of them around Malta, especially in the historic period, are from World War I and II. World War II, especially World War I, we still use wooden boats. So as these wrecks sort of started getting found by basically by Professor Gambin and some associates, the Heritage Unit, the Superintendent of Cultural Heritage in Malta, sort of realized we have a problem because we've got a heck of a lot of underwater cultural heritage, and none of us in our department sort of know what to do with it. So they created, while I was actually, just as I was leaving, it became an official department of the government, the Underwater Cultural Heritage Unit, the UCU. And so they oversee this historic shipwreck registry. This is not the extent of the historic shipwrecks in Malta, but these are the ones that technical divers can visit if they have a permit. And so I am not an expert on all of these wrecks. I have never dove on any of them because they exceed what I am capable of doing. However, the one that I know a great deal about is this one right here, the HMS Olympus, which is the deepest on the registry at 115 meters. It is the subject of my thesis, which is a little bit of what we will talk about. But before I talk about the HMS Olympus itself, because it ties into what I'm going to show you, this is the extent of what you need to sort of sign off on if you want to get a permit to dive on those historic wrecks. First of all, you need to be trained. So even here, you get this permit. If you're only trained to go to 70 meters, you're not visiting the Olympus, the Russell, the Trusty Star. You have to dive within your limits, and dive shops are obligated to stick with this. Only certain dive shops in Malta are themselves permitted and given the actual coordinates of where these sites are to take you guys to them. You guys, theoretically. Very, very few rules. And this bothers me because there's one rule in particular. So there's rules for the boat skippers in terms of where you can put your anchor in order to protect the shipwreck itself. You're not allowed to drop anchor right on the shipwreck. You have to drop anchor upwind of it so that you don't, get brushed into it. And then there's supposed to be dive leaders that go down with the actual groups. And it is unsure whether or not dive leaders actually go down with every group. And this is something where I was doing some investigation. I had to stop myself because I was going to get myself into trouble for my thesis. And then there's instructions to the actual divers. And there is literally just 3 rules. Watch your fins, do not touch, do not penetrate the wrecks. And there's a little bit too much evidence online from people's public postings that they do break these rules. And so part of the issue with this is that you're not supposed to enter the wrecks. You're not supposed to penetrate them because of the depth, because it's not safe to do so. But on top of that, these are war graves. These are, for some people, their final resting places. And while there are no longer remains there, or we've never even seen remains, because even the archaeological team that has investigated the wrecks, none of them have penetrated them. So it's not so much a matter of disturbing physical remains, but it is a matter of legality, because many of these, anytime you see HMS, that's Her Majesty's ship. They are British ships, and British law is very, very strict about who can visit and who can actually touch and interact with these wrecks. So for me as an archaeologist, as someone doing my thesis on it, I'm not able to get samples to do analysis of the Olympus wreck because I would have to go through a lot of diplomatic sort of headaches to try to get that permission. And somebody went through, wonderful diplomatic teams went through and actually got this permission for people to very delicately, in a respectful manner, et cetera, visit these wrecks. And there's concerns that it's not being followed through upon. And this is, like I said, this is where I had to get myself away from the computer, but I'm going to show it for the purpose of your education. So we're going to watch a little bit. And I should say this was put out there by one of the French dive magazines. I can't remember now. They are one of the leaders in terms of dive tourism and dive education, sort of for recreational and technical divers in the world. And it was quite upsetting to see that this was one of the videos that they sort of approved of. And this one isn't even as bad as one of the other ones I saw and has since been taken down, but we'll take a look. There's all this music here. I don't understand why. This will come up during the accessibility debate, but I'm gonna let you watch for a second while I take a sip. Now for Neil and those of you who also do underwater photogrammetry, you're getting a glimpse into why this shipwreck has not been made into a photogrammetry model yet. And this is my issue. Look at where his hands are. The footage that I'm looking at for my thesis is many, many years older than this. I think about 7 years older than this, 8 years. That section of the hull did not look that way. There was grown invertebrates. So I am concerned that people are putting their hands there and breaking off the invertebrates. So it becomes an issue of respect. You're not respecting the law. You're not respecting the fact morally that this is somebody's final resting place. It's like you're putting your hands on somebody's coffin and peering into the grave, not at the funeral itself, but after the fact. And then you also have to keep in mind that literal lives are being lost every time you put your hand on something, because all of these structures are alive. They are literal lives. Granted, we typically do not value animal lives the way that we value human lives, and absolutely the bottom line on all of those rules for the boat operators and the dive leaders and the divers, the bottom line of it is to stay safe. So if you're at risk of being blown off course, lost at sea, because it is quite deep, you grab onto the wreck and you protect yourself, yes. But that was not the case there. We can see that is blatant curiosity. And so part of what I'm doing with my thesis is looking at ways that we can ensure, ways that we can encourage stewardship and ensure that that sort of activity does not occur anymore, so that the wreck actually exists and the reef continues to exist, and that the local fishermen who collect fish that are drawn to the reef for their own subsistence continue to exist into the future. And herein lies my other issue of accessibility. What is this music? What does this music serve? What purpose does it serve? I honestly do not think it gives any addition to the ambiance. And this is what a lot of the videos of these deep water wrecks are like. They're just fun music, whatever is copyright free that is put on, and no criticism to the videographer himself. He's just putting this up as something fun for people to see. But, and this is one link that I forgot to get open ahead of time, so I'm gonna get it up now. What is, oh, I hear a dog collar. Virtual shipwreck.
Chanelle, just so you know, we can't actually hear the sound unless you share that, so we can't hear the sound. Yeah.
Well, you were missing out on anything. It wasn't very good sound. It was just like Caribbean sort of island music, which is not even geographically correct. But thank you for letting me know. I apologize about that. Virtual, what's the word? Neil, do you know what I'm talking about? The virtual museum? This is where I failed.
Underwater Malta.
Underwater Malta, there we go. So simple, and yet I absolutely failed to remember it. So if you look at the wrecks that are on all of these historic wrecks, and it's not just shipwrecks, there's airplane wrecks as well, you'll notice that the Olympus is not there, and that is because we could not make a 3D photogrammetry model of it. The Beaufighter is actually another wreck that I got to work on. It's not as deep as the other ones. You can actually see it from recreational dive limits, and we recovered some human remains from it for the DPAA. So okay, let's just pick one of these wrecks and look at it. And so this is why I dislike it, because this is considered the top of the line accessibility and outreach efforts for underwater archaeology. This is the extent of it. This is all we're doing. We're creating a nice 3D photogrammetry model. We're putting it up online. We're saying, look, everybody has access to it. You don't even need a Sketchfab account to access it. We're making nice videos. We're putting them up on YouTube. There's no education there, and it's extremely ableist, because I'm assuming that all of us here are able to benefit from this, but there's absolutely nothing there if you do not have the added benefit of vision. And these are very tactile. These are very emotional sites. These are sites that have a lot of other senses that can be engaged in them. And you feel that if you're diving on them, there's a story to be told about these sites, and we're failing to do it if we rely on the visual, but we're also failing a huge portion of the population that is underserved, and either because of the physicalities of not having access to this infrastructure, like I couldn't, this is a big fan, underwater Malta, I should have known that. But you know, somebody who does not know that it exists and somebody who does not have the ability to actually see it. There's writing, there's this sort of information about it. It's a pint-sized glimpse into the site's history at best, but you don't get nearly as much from that writing as you do from this sort of 3D photogrammetry model if we are, you know, able to visually see it and explore it. And so part of my thesis that I did not officially get approval to write, but I stubbornly decided I was going to do it anyways, has been looking at the sort of historic tendencies. So comparing baseball radio commentary to television commentary and picking up on what was actually needed in order to tell that story without the added benefit of vision. And I'm sort of trying to develop a way to tell the story of the HMS Olympus in a way that's going to be truly accessible to hopefully more people than a 3D photogrammetry model would be, especially since we can't actually make that 3D photogrammetry model anyways. And then I am coming close to the end, if I can get my things to work. This is a pain. I apologize. It's this one here. So this is one of the other sites that I got to work on. And this is a big part of why I have this idea of what accessibility is important as well. The HMS Urge submarine, and I don't know how this happened. I am not a fan of submarines. I mean, I am, obviously they're very cool, but I did not know I wanted to study submarines. And I ended up working on 2 submarine projects in a matter of months. But the HMS Urge was found while I was in Malta, while I was on the boat, very, very close to the Olympus. And it was found on a project that was funded by the captain's grandson. And so he was actually there on the boat with us. He was one of the first people to lay eyes on this submarine in 75 odd years. And I remember talking with him, and because I was already working on the Olympus, I was telling him about, like, you know, what we might expect. And he was asking questions, how do we identify a submarine at depth? You know, because I was telling him about the ecosystem that would grow off of it. And we went through some of this stuff. We gave him sort of a crash course on it. And he became very, very emotional when he finally actually set eyes on it. And he made the comment that he just wished his mother could see it. His mother was still around, but she has very, very nearsightedness, and she's not going to be able to distinguish what's on the screen. So it sort of opened my eyes to, like, you know, the descendants of the people who died on these sites. We're now making them accessible to divers around the world and anybody with an internet connection who wants to take a gander at something interesting, but we're not making them accessible to the people who lost loved ones on them. And so that's something that definitely needs to be improved moving forward, as well as obviously giving people closure whenever we can. And so working with agencies like the DPA in Malta, you know, these agencies, these home countries of soldiers at any, or sailors of any of the sites. The site I was working on with the DPAA was an airplane, actually. But any of these lost souls have to be cleared by their government before technical divers are allowed to simply visit them. And so that is definitely something there, because we want to make sure that, you know, it's not just a gimmick to raise money. It's not just a way for, you know, for people to have some fun of things. We want to ensure that they last into the future for the benefit of this holistic society, and to ensure that the people who need access to them most have that access for their emotional well-being as well. I can sort of close off my presentation there and open up the floor to questions if anybody has any. Oh, am I still sharing a screen?
No.
No, okay, good, I finished that. All right, hopefully you were able to see whatnot. And
so folks, you can turn your video back on if you want. and we can have questions for Chanelle.
I'm going to start copying and pasting some links into the chat so that I don't forget. And yeah, if you have a question,
Chantal,
blurt it out.
absolutely amazing work you've done there. I've read a lot of history about Malta over the years, and it's like you've just shown, absolutely amazing time capsule on various locations. I've also noted that recently we've seen some deepwater ROV work throughout the Mediterranean. And again, these we're learning so much that we never knew before. Great job, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and so a lot of the ROV and AUV information that we're getting nowadays is coming from probably the RPM Hercules, which is a fantastic vessel, and that actually has its home docked in Malta very strategically because it is the center of the Mediterranean. So it's able to, within a single season, go up to Sicily and Palermo, go east to Croatia, Greece, and south to Libya and Tunisia. And yes, absolutely. I mean, they had the first successful retrieval of ship rams. Is Robin here? Robin will know what boat I'm talking about because it's in Assassin's Creed.
Oh, the trireme.
Yes, thank you. Yes, so the rams that were used for combat. And so these rams actually like fell off during some of the Punic Wars. And each of the RPM crew actually managed to retrieve them using ROV arms very, very delicately, which is, yeah, absolutely amazing. Like we would not have been able to imagine that 5 years ago, you know, let alone when George Bass, may he rest in peace, would have been sort of doing all this as well. So very interesting stuff. And that's why I pointed out sort of the 20-meter limit, because the Uluburun shipwreck, everything that, you know, was first done, the groundwork that was set in maritime archaeology was all very shallow for a reason, because we didn't have the technology or the techniques to dive deeper. So yeah. Yes, anybody else?
Neil, an awful quiet bunch around here. You rev them up.
I know. I can't believe there aren't more questions. Jeez.
I have a question. It's okay.
I never know. That's either a good thing, like either I covered everything or I managed to intimidate everybody into silence. So
Go ahead, Shannon.
Hey, Chanelle, how you doing?
hi, good, yourself?
Good. Of course, Son knew exactly why you shouldn't touch the wreck, because it would interfere with the microorganisms and then the fish won't come back to feed on them and yada, yada, yada. So I'm like, okay, yeah, he doesn't have any questions of you. He knows it all. But
I approve.
I take your point on accessibility, you know, and if you're putting everything online, that indicates that someone has to have access to, you know, digital means to do so as well. But it is a good means. But, you know, like looking at ableism and such like that, I guess it's all about, another aspect would be about the content that you're putting on there. Like you did a lot of work with regards to the marine life, but there doesn't seem to be emphasized in the websites that you've shown. So I think that, you know, a more holistic approach to a wreck, you know, as an organism in itself, and a wreck and a war grave and all of these things, I take your point completely. Maybe a virtual and verbal tour of the thing would be useful as well. That's all I have.
Yeah. And absolutely, like that's another point, and that's why I sort of made the point at the beginning that I am going to emphasize the fact that they are war graves, because I love the fact that divers want to visit these sites, but too often, and like, it's not the diver's fault. I think in some areas you get pampered, you know, you get to learn on scuttled wrecks where it doesn't matter if you damage something accidentally, you know, because it's a 20-year-old Coast Guard cutter that was purposefully put there for you to practice your skills on. But then you get these divers that sort of, because things look so unearthly. There's just a disconnect between something that doesn't belong there. We don't realize the sort of human aspect, and especially when we're looking at something as old as the Phoenician shipwrecks, we forget the fact that there was people associated with that. So there's definitely an ethical sort of balancing act that needs, I love the virtual accessibility. That is absolutely a great starting point. It's just, we can't stop there. And when we do that, we still need to make sure that the point gets across that there's other considerations to be brought into mind. Like you said, absolutely. Talk about what organisms are on these wrecks. Talk about what the local community has connected to these, but also talk about the fact that, is it ethical that we're putting these grave sites up online? And I absolutely think, like, for the people who need the closure of them, for the people who need it most, that should be a way, because we in Western society, we have this cultural significance of going and visiting people's graves and laying wreaths and laying flowers. You can't do that when somebody was lost at sea. And Neil's doing fantastic work with SPSNL, laying laying wreaths every Memorial Day. And there's small efforts like that coming up around the world, but it needs to be more, and it needs to be more diverse, and something that we need to think about a little bit more. Yeah, sites are very easily disturbed. A simple errant kick can absolutely, and that's one thing that there's a whole consideration in my thesis that I did not discuss because it's very chemistry heavy. We very much want to minimize finning on these sites, people moving their fins. If you're on these sites, please use a frog fin, do not flutter kick. Not only does a frog fin physically not disturb as much sediment, but it also introduces less oxygen to the areas near the site, which means that the ecosystems that are there are going to stay in stasis, and we're not sort of going to spur on any more corrosion that could impact the site more and cause it to decay faster. So very delicate. They're robust. I mean, they're strong. These are warships, but the more we open them up, the more people start to visit them, the more potential for harm to sort of come to them.
Chanelle, can you talk a little bit about the differences in the level of funding and effort for underwater archaeology in Malta compared to Canada or elsewhere in the EU?
Yeah, I absolutely can. So Malta is definitely sort of spurring on with getting more funding now than they used to have. It's one of those interesting things. And like, I think about this even as I like diving in Greece. You go for a dive in Greece and you just like, you look down. And I'm like, I'm there, I'm on vacation, I'm at the family home. I'm thinking, I'm not looking, I'm not paying attention to anything. My eyes can actually relax. And you look down at the ground and you see amphora. And it's so commonplace there. There's almost this like disconnect that what we in Canada would be like, what? That there's just like, yeah, okay, whatever. And so what gets funded is very, very different than what would here. So yeah, I mean, pretty much like in Malta excavating in Salina Bay, we had the ceramicist from the Superintendent of Cultural Heritage come out. And this was a field school, so it was very low cost. And we were basically, you can't really mess it up, do what you want. And they're sort of like, if you find anything interesting, we'll invest more in the future. So we started finding Roman ceramics. And they're all like, really? No, we can't get anything. We can't get funding for this because Roman ceramics are just everywhere in Malta. Then we started finding Islamic period ceramics or Arab period, which is much newer than the Roman ceramics, but very rare in terms of, like, we know that there was an Arabic influence on the island. We know that there was a very long period of time when the Arab sort of, not only, like, they were the administrators of the island, and that's why the Maltese language has some Arab influence, the food, everything. I think it was like 500 years of occupation. I could go back to the slide. I'm not good with the dates, I'm not good with the what. And this was something that, so even though we had the records and we knew that they were there, we had no material evidence, very little material evidence of them. And so finding these few pieces of Islamic ware, it's like all of a sudden that site became much more important and, you know, basically guaranteed itself for at least 5 more seasons of funding right then and there. But there's a lot more interest in it there, I think, partially because of the fact that they need to rely on, well, I guess there's a lot that goes into it. I'm going to be very critical of Canada and the States right now, but we sort of look at I talk to non-divers or I talk to non-archaeologists, and there's this notion that the first people in North America to sort of ply the waves were Europeans. And that is absolutely not true. And so the funding for what is European content is very, very low because it's not very old, and we seem to place more value on something that is older. In Malta, where you have so many years of continuous occupation and continuous inheritance, there's much more pride towards anything that they find. And you can very easily aggravate a Maltese person by telling them that, you know, 90% of their very famous names, their political names, weren't Maltese. They came in with the Corsairs. They were from Slovenia, they were from Croatia, they were from Greece and Italy. They're not Maltese. They don't care about that. There's this natural pride about anybody that they've taken on as their own. And so being this, you know, this jewel of Mediterranean that everybody wanted makes it a lot easier to get political funding. And I mean, you look at some of the projects, Air Malta, the tourism boards, like major grocery store chains are all willing to sort of chip in for funding besides the government itself. Then you've got the resources, the natural gas resources, the, the people who want to know what's down there, like where can we set up fish farms? Where can we build infrastructure? Where can we actually put the free port? Because we know that there's World War II airplanes out there and we need to put the free port somewhere. So there's a lot of funding coming from different areas and different people interested in knowing what's going on, versus in Canada, unfortunately, I think it falls to the academics a lot more, and it's a lot easier for it to also get sort of hobbyists that are very interested that don't have that same level of respect and maybe become treasure hunters and looters. So like, that's why groups like the SPSNL are so important, because you instill this knowledge and this information and stewardship that helps prevent that, which is why I'm so happy to do this talk. I don't know if that answered the question. I mean, like, I'm not looking at budgets, so I don't actually know.
Because, I mean, we have, I would say in Newfoundland alone, we would have many, many, many more shipwrecks than the island of Malta would have. But dive tourism on Malta is a huge proportion of their total tourism dollar. I mean, there's so many dive operations there, and it brings in so many people from away. And the Maltese have a huge pride in their history, in the tangible part of their history. You know, like everywhere you go, there's fortifications and metallurgic structures and all that. So, I mean, they've got much more tangible touch on history and culture than we do, I think.
It's also, I mean, Malta, you go, like I'm wearing a t-shirt that has galleries on it from, you know, the apartment I was living in Valletta was a 400-year-old apartment building. Like, I can't fathom that living here in North America. And I was like, yeah, just like casual student housing, living there, whatever. Like, that's like literally unfathomable being back in North America now. And it's like, because you're walking around this easily 500-year-old city, and even that is a drop in the bucket in their history. And that's why I put the ship graffiti on there, because you're walking around and you're seeing this 500-year-old historic structures like the palaces and everything else, the palazzos, because they weren't exactly palaces, because palaces relate to nobility and the palazzos were sort of noble houses. I'm not just being pretentious by throwing in a Italian word there. But, you know, so many people walk around, they just look at the structure and they're like, oh yeah, nice architecture. But if you look closely, those stones actually, they're so soft that you could engrave into them with pretty much just your fingernails sometimes. And people have engraved in ships. And you can go across Malta. You can do like hiking tours or walking tours across the island and see different historic walls and structures built throughout history, not just from the Knights period. What's the word? Excuse me. Prison cells in Fort St. Angelo, walls that delineated parishes in the inlands, and people have carved just with whatever tool, whatever sharp rock or stick they could find, ships. And these are like very tangible pieces of history. Like we can tell what type of ship that was from some of the traits on it. You know, it's not just a kid's crayon semicircle with a stick and a sail on it. There's details, there's rams, there's gun holes, there's oars, and you can tell how many oars. And, you know, it's something that there's a lot more pride even just in the work that was done to make those. And then people knowing where they are and thinking that this graffiti, this 500-year-old graffiti is worth preserving, that they've created projects. And I mean, we contributed to it as students. It was one of our assignments to go off and find one of these and write a report on it that then got put up on this website. Sort of perhaps slightly unethical, but because we didn't know what it was going towards. But there's this, yeah, there's definitely, and you know, whether or not there's more shipwrecks in Newfoundland than Malta, I don't know, because you have such a long history of shipwrecks that might have preserved. It's a matter of known shipwrecks. Because like I said, like the Phoenician shipwreck, we didn't know about it until, you know, 10 years ago, because there was nobody, no record to report that this ship never made it home, because who knows how long that voyage would have been. If there was somebody that remembered, hey, my husband didn't come home, they had no way to record that, or were not looking for that recording. And even so, they have no clue where in the Mediterranean it went missing. So it's total happenstance when we find it. And the government is working towards creating an entire bathymetric map that has already enlightened. I mean, you've got the Phoenician shipwreck, you've got the Olympus, you've got all of those historic shipwrecks, which are all outside of recreational dive zones. So they were all found by sonar, plus the Urge that I was part of. So this is like 50 wrecks that were found in a handful of years. And that's not counting what's underneath the sand. And there's the potential that like anything that had a hard, heavy cargo has a very good likelihood of having been preserved if it was wrecked somewhere where there was a sandy bottom that was deep enough. So it's like, it's just a matter of time. I love both islands. I love the underwater heritage of both islands. For me, it doesn't matter who has more, but I'm very interested to see what's going to continue to come up with time in Malta.
I'm going to make a plug here just before we get some other questions. If Malta is almost an ideal dive destination, if you're looking for a holiday with diving in the Mediterranean, it's such a great place. It's easy to get to from any airport in Europe, pretty much. It's a safe place to go. They speak English. There are dozens and dozens of dive operations on the main island of Malta and over on Gozo as well. And they cater to any level of diver that cares to go there. So it's a very popular destination with Northern Europeans who are just newly certified divers, and it goes all the way to ultra deep diving technical divers that want to go down 100 meters. So yeah. And the infrastructure is great, and the food and the wine and everything else is fabulous. So you'll definitely enjoy yourself there, and it's quite reasonably priced.
It's one of those things like people ask me like, okay, well, where should I go? Because I have experience and I have sort of ties to now 3 different places in the Mediterranean. And I'm like, okay, well, if you want, what do you want? Do you want a relaxing, sit on the beach, swim and sunbathe vacation? Don't go to Malta, because the beaches are horrible. And I say this with all the love in the world, but go to Greece, because you've got those nice shallow beaches, and you can, you know, if you're not a swimmer, you can wade out for 500 meters, and little 5'4" me is still, you know, just starting to tread water at 500 meters away. It's lovely and it's calm. Malta, you've got strong waves, and because it gets deep so quickly, it's much colder water in terms of at that beachy area. You know, it's not the nice relaxing saunas type water that you get in Greece, but the diving in Malta is fantastic. Not that Greece doesn't have good diving, but you got to know where to go in Greece. And Malta, I mean, it's a small island and you've got everything there. In Greece, you need to have somebody tell you which islands are worth going to for diving. So definitely, if you're looking for a dive vacation, absolutely, Malta is a great place. And it's not as like overrun as
wanted to
Bonaire.
invite other folks here with questions to jump in.
Absolutely.
I've got to go. Thank you very much. Nice meeting you by Zoom. See you next time, Neil. Thanks for the invite.
You bet, Jim. See you later.
Okay,
Thank
bye.
you, Jim.
Thanks.
But yeah, absolutely. Questions away.
You know, I just had a comment. You were asking about budgets and stuff there. So just for an example, that project that I was on in Cyprus was 1 month in duration. It covered the boats, the accommodations, and the gases, and it was €250,000. So it was not cheap.
No. I mean, the ROV that we had, no, the AUV that we had with the school was a €3 million AUV. And they're telling us this as we are, you know, 4 students picking it up and circling it around to calibrate it. We're midair, you know, trying not to trip over rocks. And somebody goes, by the way, that's €3 million. And we're all just like, well, thanks. We almost just dropped it just because of that. But no, it's, yeah, I mean, a university department that is a department of the university that has 1 professor has that. That tells you something.
Yeah.
But I mean, technically, it's also the Underwater Cultural Heritage's property as well. So
You just threw it over the rail when you're ready to use it.
I mean, we were out there as students without a professor out on the boat, and we're responsible for getting this back on board. So it's definitely, you have a, you know, everybody or the professor owes you a drink that day. Each person who finds the AUV after the day of survey, because, you know, it's down for 4 hours to 8 hours, and all of a sudden you have no clue where it's come up. You're looking over the waves. Whoever spots it, you get a drink, whether it's a cappuccino or an Aperol spritz. You're the prize student that day, because they're not cheap pieces of equipment.
How much diving did you get in, Chanelle, when you were there?
During field season, during our field school, 2 dives a day for the month. And then I didn't get as many dives as I wanted to. I got a good few. I don't know if Rick is here from Ocean Quest. He put me in touch with a woman who lived there who had Newfoundland roots.
Yeah.
And she actually took me diving a fair bit. Her and a friend of hers. So I had
That's
sort of
Miranda,
a local
right?
guide. Miranda, yeah.
Yeah.
It was amazing. I had great instructors, and well, not instructors, but fantastic local divers with really great local knowledge of the area. So I got in. Neil knows me. I'm very bad at keeping a logbook because I have 3 logbooks and I just don't use them. So I got in about 75 dives there, I'd say. So, and I mean, and that being said, because I was cheap and I was doing this as a student, I was doing the shore dives. I wasn't going on any of the boat dives. So there's so many wrecks there that I want to see. Not even talking about the historic deep water wrecks, just like there's so many more dive sites around the island that I have not gotten to see yet. So fingers crossed someday I can go back.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meantime,
Anybody else with questions?
All right, I have a question.
yeah.
Sorry, I'm at work, so I've only listened to like a short bit of this. I'm sure I missed a thing or 12. Is that the only place you've studied shipwrecks, or have you gone other places, or is that something you just are most knowledgeable about this area? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, so I studied shipwrecks, and where I'm most knowledgeable, I've dove on shipwrecks in Greece Newfoundland, North Carolina, Florida, and Malta now. I think that's it. Hopefully soon, as of this summer, Ontario as well will join that. But I'm most knowledgeable of the Maltese shipwrecks just because even though the program was Global Maritime Archaeology, it sort of was Global Maritime Archaeology from the focus of Malta's maritime history that has had the world come to it, which is fine. That sort of works very well because, you know, you can study a whole bunch of different cultures all within one island. And I mean, like, this island is smaller than Newfoundland, but has like 7 times the population.
Well, let's back up. This island is 26 kilometers long. It's really small.
I think one day I was chatting with one of my MUN colleagues, Pamela, and she's like, I was telling her that I was going for a dive. She's like, oh, how far is it? I was like, oh, I have to go all the way across the island. And she's in PEI. And I told her how far across it was. She goes, that's smaller than PEI. I was like, really? But yeah, it's a pretty small island. But yes, Newfoundland absolutely has great diversity of wrecks and fantastic preservation of wrecks. So that's one of the things, like, Malta has not as good preservation of wrecks considering the date of some of them, because the chemistry gets so affected by the temperature. And so Malta being so much warmer has had a little bit more corrosion than the Newfoundland wrecks. And the Newfoundland wrecks also have a little bit less marine life on them, I think, or different types of marine life compared to sort of what's on the HMS Olympus, like just schools of fish everywhere. So it's very interesting. But yeah, I don't know. My whole sort of thesis project, the whole idea of developing a framework gives me this flexibility to know that I can sort of go anywhere. I don't need to specialize on one time period or geographic region. I can sort of be a tool to help on other places. So hopefully someday I'll get to say that I know a lot about a whole bunch more other places. But I think Malta's no, because Greece was the first historic wrecks I dove on. And then Malta, I dove on more historic wrecks, but Florida was all scuttled wrecks, all deliberately put there. They weren't as interesting. You don't get as much of the marine life growth on them. They're very clean wrecks. So for me, that was like, okay, well, lots of sharks, but what else?
Any more?
Yeah, Newfoundland.
Chanelle, you're going to be really bored when we take you on the wrecks in Ottawa area.
I'm looking forward to it. Like, because there's so many wrecks here too, and it's all a new experience. So getting to combine sort of cold
There's
water,
not
getting
really
back into
much
dry
for
season
marine
as well.
life.
No, that's exactly true, Lindsay.
Yeah, but we'll take you anyway, Chanelle. Don't worry.
I've seen pictures of the zebra mussels, and this is what I'm very interested in.
Yeah.
There's like, I forget where, well, it was in Tobermory. There was
Oh,
a picture
good
of
old Tobermory.
I know, I got to get out this summer. There's a picture of a wreck, and somebody was shocked because there was 2 handrails going down, and one was entirely covered in zebra mussels. One was not at all. And I'm like, what's going on there? I want to figure this out.
Yeah,
so that is like a goal this summer, to see if I can, like, is it currents? What's going on? Why is like 1/2 just completely barren? So my brain will still be entertained, rest assured.
All right. So you'll either be really bored or you will teach us a lot. So we're looking forward to it anyway.
Hopefully, I mean, I don't want to teach. I'm happy to, but I don't have that ego, but hopefully I'm not bored, and I doubt I would be.
Okay, well, I really want to thank you, Chanelle. That was
Thank you, Chanelle.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here.
Anybody else have a last question before we cut this off? That's it. Okay. Thanks.
All right.
Thank you, Chanelle.
Thank you all. You're a great audience.
Back to Malta diving. I really can't wait.
I'll go with you next time.
Okay, that's a deal. Thanks everybody for showing up, and we'll have another talk next month, and we'll be posting a notice on Facebook as we always do. And we welcome you to tell all your friends about this talk. If anybody wants to look at it, we'll be posting it soon on the Shipwreck Society YouTube channel, and we'll post a notice on Facebook with a link so you can go and watch it. Okay, thanks very much, everyone.
Have a great
good night,
evening.
everybody.
Good night.